welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Let's talk One Piece, specifically the last part of the Dressrosa arc. Now, I believe that One Piece is a story for our times. It is actually a story for all times, and one of the things that makes it so, in my mind, is its exuberant and insightful incorporation of themes. And one of my favorite themes that One Piece explores is compassion, the idea of compassion. How does compassion work? What do we gain from compassion? It isn't a simple message of compassion equals good. Often there are prices to pay for compassion. And of course, the reverse. What does it mean to not be compassionate? What are the consequences? This is a brilliant exploration of compassion, much like one of my other favorite series of all time, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or even the themes that I explore in my own writing. I focus a lot on compassion. So this is a theme that is very important to me, and I think important to a lot of people. It is one of the most important themes that a great work of literature or a story can explore in my mind. And One Piece does an absolutely brilliant job of it. It is subtle in many ways. It is beautiful in many ways in its portrayal and exploration of compassion. So I want to focus on this theme for this second half of Dressrosa video. I realize that I'm going to be not talking about many aspects of this magnificent arc as a result, but I think it's well worth it focusing on compassion, because it is a theme that, of course, is not unique to Dressrosa. It is pervasive in One Piece. But I think it'll be fun to actually focus on compassion as the theme as I talk about the second half. And I have talked about other themes in this arc already in the first half of the Dressrosa, the video I made on the first half of this arc, where I talked about things like will and freedom and family and parent-child relationships. All of that stuff is still very much in the mix here. And all of these actually relate to compassion as well. So I think it'll be a fruitful discussion to have. And as always, of course, I want to hear what all of you think about not only this theme, but anything that you feel is important in the Dressrosa arc. And also, if you want to see, if you haven't seen that first half video that I made on this, or any other One Piece video that I made, I do have a playlist. I haven't been mentioning that too much in these videos, but I do have a One Piece playlist on my channel. I have a playlist for other manga that I have read and other books and series that I have read as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at this theme of compassion and some of the most beautiful, in my mind, moments and characters in this magnificent arc. First of all, of course, what is compassion? And I think you could have a long philosophical debate about it, but if you go through a kind of etymological look at the word, it is to feel with someone, to suffer with someone, to feel along with and to suffer with someone, to put yourself in another's place. And not only that, but I think compassion implies for many of us the idea that not only do we want to feel another person's suffering, but we want to do something about it. We want to act on that feeling. We want to not just commiserate, but also help if we can. And this is, I think, a crucial aspect of the way I want to explore how Oda portrays this theme. And again, there are ways in which you could question whether compassion is the most helpful response. But let's see. Let's take some examples here. How about Luffy's interactions with Bellamy? Okay, let's just start with that. Now, I'm going to work my way up to some of the bigger examples, but this is a beautiful one too, I think. Bellamy, of course, is very conflicted. Beautiful job, by the way, on Oda's part of giving us another conflicted character. Bellamy wants to live up to his dream of becoming part of the Don Quixote family, okay? And he wants to maintain his integrity in that. He wants to go the full course here. But he also knows very well at this point what kind of person Doflamingo is, that he has essentially discarded Bellamy, that he is not a worthy idol, but he wants to see the course through. And I think this is something that Luffy can understand, even as Luffy feels compassion for Bellamy. Luffy wants to stop him, but he wants to do it without hurting Bellamy. And this is in contrast to Doflamingo's complete lack of empathy and compassion when it comes to not just Bellamy, but any character in the story, pretty much. In fact, Doflamingo takes pleasure in the pain and suffering of others. That is pretty much the opposite of compassion. He even says, the weak do not have the right to choose how they die. Now, it was interesting because, of course, we know another character who said that earlier, that is Trafalgar Law, and we see his heavy influence on Trafalgar Law and the child that had come to the Don Quixote family in order to wreak havoc on the world, to obtain some kind of twisted vengeance, what have you. And so that was a powerful influence, but Luffy has also had an influence on Trafalgar Law, and more importantly, another character that we will talk about later, that we have to talk about, and that is, of course, Corazon. I'm looking forward to talking about that character very much. In fact, for me, Corazon is the MVP of the Dressrosa saga. No competition in my mind, although he's Luffy, of course, right? So, but I just love what Corazon does here, and we'll talk about him. But let's talk about even the other. I mentioned Doflamingo. What about the villains in here? Is it right to feel compassion for the villain characters? And I think that Oda does lead us on that path in certain cases, for sure. Well, he does elicit the reader's compassion. He gives us these backstories to a lot of these villain characters, the members of the Don Quixote family. For example, there's Pink, Senor Pink, for whom Frankie, even after a really tremendous battle, feels some compassion and even says, he says someday we'll have to talk about this woman named Russian, and what happened to Pink. He feels for this adversary. There's been some kind of a bond that has formed between the two of them as a result, ironically, of their fighting with each other. Respect has grown there. Also, a feeling with Frankie is a very compassionate character in general, but to have him feel that for an adversary is really something there. There's an understanding that leaps out there. And I think that it's interesting that we get these backstories so that, like Frankie, we do feel a little bit of compassion, so of feeling sympathy at the very least for some of these villain characters. Maybe not all. We did get the backstory to Doflamingo himself, and I never really, I have to confess, felt a ton of sympathy or compassion. But we'll talk about Doflamingo in a bit. So how about Kyros, a favorite of mine from the first half of the Dressrosa arc, and he continues to be a compelling character here. His relationship with Rebecca is particularly beautiful, I think, and there's a sense that he does not want Rebecca to experience the loss of self that comes with hurting another, with fighting. And that is, of course, a legacy that Rebecca has from her mother, and the desire not to harm others. In fact, it is a promise that her mother made her make, which is why she never hurts anyone. When she's even in the gladiatorial combat, she's simply evading other people's attacks. She's never hurting anyone. And her father wants to preserve that in her, and that is part of his compassion for her. He doesn't want her to become like him, in a sense, right? And that is a beautiful aspect of this story. I want to return to it as well. But I also want to emphasize how her aunt, Viola, also acts out of compassion. And in a moment near the end of the whole thing, when Don Quixote is controlling both of them and is going to have Rebecca hurt her aunt or even kill her, she essentially bids Rebecca to close her eyes and forgives her in advance for anything that she does while under Doflamingo's control. Thank goodness, of course, Luffy comes just in time. But you can see Viola is a person of great compassion as well, like most of her family, actually. We're going to talk about them right now, actually. So King Riku and the royal family. Also, by extension, the people of Dressrosa. I want to talk about all of them. I want to first emphasize how the Don Quixote family stands for the principle of might makes right, essentially. That is their philosophy, that if we have the power to hurt other people, we get to do it. Never mind compassion. They are the opposite. They have this sort of blatant militarism, this cult-like worship of power. They just like power and controlling others, especially Doflamingo. Whereas Riku is pretty much the opposite. He stands for peace and compassion. How effective is that, though, for a leader? And this is a question that comes up that Oda poses right out of Riku's own mouth. Is it weak to be compassionate? I think it's a legitimate thing to explore here. Did Riku fail because of his refusal to use violence, to use force? In other words, does compassion make you weak? This is the question that comes up. In other words, do we need someone strong like Zoro, for example, to protect us from the bullies of the world, people like Pika and Doflamingo and the others? Perhaps, I think, there is an answer that Oda puts out there. He's too brilliant of a storyteller to hit us over the head with any kind of answer, but I think he puts something out there that is worth thinking about. And we see it in the response of the people of Dressrosa, those that work together to not only help the injured and the helpless as they're fleeing from the birdcage that is constricting all around them, but ultimately they take an active part in their own liberation. They participate in their own salvation by finding the courage to push against that cage. And it is doing the impossible together as they are urged by Zoro and the others, doing the impossible. In the end, you have the gladiators like Bartolomeo, and you have the others, the Tontaras, joining with the citizens in this group effort. And there is something beautiful about that. I think that what you see here is people taking an active role against their oppression and for their own freedom, all without harming anyone. And perhaps there is a suggestion here that peaceful and compassionate resistance to evil and oppression can change the world. It has happened before in history. It has. You have examples of people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi in the world. We've talked about them before, and I think that these types of people are definitely people that Oda has thought about before in the process of his storytelling, for sure. So I mentioned the Tontaras a moment ago, and yet another example, I think a really fun one, is Mancherry, the Tontara princess. Now, of course, the Don Quixote family exploits her compassion. And again, I think it's a legitimate exploration of how it maybe sometimes compassion is not the appropriate response. Maybe, just maybe. Or maybe compassion in combination with wisdom, with knowledge, right? But alone by itself, just compassion as a response to everything may not be the healthiest thing. But later, Mancherry does employ her ability to heal to great measure, and it is through her tears, through her compassion, her feeling with the suffering of others, the pain of others, that she makes a difference. And such compassion is, as it says in One Piece, as it says in one of the panels, such compassion is indeed a noble way to fight. And then you have Fujitora. Fujitora, one of my favorite Navy figures, for sure, by a long shot, really. I may have let some hints drop previously that I'm not a fan of some of the Navy people. But I really did like this character, Fujitora, a lot. And I think that, for example, he reaches an understanding with Sabo. That's one of the earlier indications that this guy is actually okay in some ways. And later, he works with the people of Dressrosa against the birdcage. Very important. His form of justice, to me, includes compassion. And to me, that is necessary. Just as compassion without wisdom, without knowledge, could be a mistake, I think that justice without compassion is not true justice. Okay? And I've said this before and had some discussions with people in the comments about it, but I really truly believe that if you have just justice, rigid, okay, you broke the law, therefore here's your punishment. If that's your approach, I think you're missing something important. That compassion is necessary sometimes to ameliorate justice, okay? And I think that Fujitora really shows us this. And he sees the world government's complicitness in the evil that has been done here on Dressrosa and elsewhere, I expect, as well. But the moment when he apologizes so publicly essentially in before the world witnesses this apology that Fujitora offers on behalf of the world government for the pain and the suffering they have inflicted. It's because Fujitora is a compassionate individual, and he bows down and apologizes for the wrongs done to the people of Dressrosa. This is an act of compassion, and is unlike the people in the world government who think that they must show only strength all the time, and if they make a mistake, if they fail in any way, they have to lie to cover it up, and even perhaps get rid of the witnesses, right? Because they can't show any bit of weakness. Otherwise, they will seem weak, and weakness is the enemy, right? So I love Fujitora's willingness to appear weak. And by the way, I don't think you're weak at all if you have the integrity and the courage to offer compassion to someone. I think that is a terrible misreading of what compassion is. The idea that somehow it's weak to apologize and ask someone for forgiveness when you've done wrong. I think that takes integrity and courage and strength, actually. So I love Fujitora, love his role here, and I think he is a wonderful example of how someone working within the world government, and of course I understand as well that he's got some kind of long-term goal here. He wants to undermine at least part of the government system because he wants to get rid of the Seven Warlords system. He sees the injustice of that, the lack of compassion in that. There are other figures who were kind of in addition to Fujitora, a really neat surprise in here, and one was we have seen that the celestial dragons are actually capable of compassion before, but we get a really interesting character here in Doflamingo's father. So Doflamingo himself, like most celestial dragons and people in places of privilege, let's be honest, is kind of self-centered, very self-centered. In Doflamingo's case, I would say he goes all the way to being a sociopath, and he's all about his privilege and doesn't really care about anyone else's pain. He lacks compassion, right? He thinks, and because of his own nature, he thinks that everyone is vicious by nature, right? And he's just going to climb on top of everybody. And the celestial dragons in general are an example of how the lack of compassion, like Doflamingo's, leads to oppression. And also to, on the part of the people who are oppressed, often desperation and violence. Because violence is done to them, sometimes they lash out with violence as well as a way to redress the wrongs. I'm not saying that's the right way to go necessarily, but it's understandable as a response to oppression. And these people in these such positions of power, they don't care about the suffering they inflict to maintain their privilege. That's the thing. Sometimes they even enjoy that suffering. It's a mark of their distinction. But Doflamingo's father, Homing, I believe he's named, he's a rare case of someone who is born into such privilege but can see what it means, how it harms others. And he sees himself as human. That's the interesting thing is, rather than separating himself from the rest of humanity, saying, I'm superior, like the rest of the celestial dragons do, like Doflamingo wants to do, he sees his connection. He sees his connection to others. And that is a very necessary ingredient to compassion, that he sees that he is a human and emphasizes that. Unfortunately, again, is just blanket compassion on his part going to solve the problems that the celestial dragons have inflicted on the world? Unfortunately not. In fact, this one act of isolated compassion can't change the world and leads to tragedy, you could say, for himself and his family. He made himself and his family vulnerable by leaving that position of privilege and suffering the resentment, the hatred of the people who had suffered under the celestial dragons, finding a convenient place to vent their rage. And that is, of course, part of Doflamingo's backstory. And, I would just say that, yeah, poor Doflamingo, okay, that was a bad thing that happened to him, but he didn't have to respond the way he did. Of course, he has a brother who went through exactly the same thing and responded very differently to it. So I guess I don't feel terribly sorry for Doflamingo, even though he feels sorry for himself. So we see how an individual like Doflamingo's father, by himself in isolation, through compassion, cannot change the world, cannot change the systemic oppression that surrounds them. But that is not to say that an individual can't make a difference. And this is something that we see beautifully illustrated in Trafalgar Water Law's backstory. I'm not going to talk a lot about the whole D thing. I think it's interesting, though, just to make a note here. The people of D, the D people who are the enemies of the gods, all that stuff, very interesting. I want to see where that goes, but I'm focusing on the compassion here, so I want to talk about that. And of course, what we see in Traffy's backstory, I love calling him Traffy, just like Luffy. We see the consequences in his backstory which was very beautiful, by the way. Beautiful and sad and compelling. Beautiful because of what happens later in it, but in the beginning we see the consequences of a lack of compassion, essentially, in this tragic story of White Town, or Flevance, as it's called. And you have this white lead, which leads to this terrible disease, and through ignorance and fear, which, by the way, are enemies of compassion, the lack of connection, you see this other as different from you, you do not connect to them, and that leads to fear. The ignorance of them leads to fear, which of course leads to hatred. I sound like Yoda now, don't I? But obviously a lack of compassion. And the world government knew about what white lead was and what it did, and because it was profitable, they allowed it to happen. As if this hasn't happened in our world. You know, you could look at the pharmaceutical industry in recent times and the various opioids that they knew very well would cause a lot of harm, but the government let it happen. You know, there are so many examples in our history of this kind of thing. This is not stuff that Oda's making up by himself. This has actually happened in the world. And it's a pretty disgusting lack of mercy, a lack of feeling. In the name of profit, in the name of selfishness and greed. And so you can understand where Trafalgar Law would have this youthful indifference to life. And it's not just a response to his imminent death, which is, of course, bad enough. I'm going to die, so, you know, what the hell? Well, you know. But also the lack of compassion that he's experienced from the world government and other people who basically out of fear and ignorance and hatred treated the people of Flevance like less than human. A total lack of compassion he experiences in his life until he meets Corazon. Now, I want to emphasize the name Rocinante. Rocinante, of course, is the pack horse, Don Quixote's pack horse in the tale by Cervantes. And, of course, like that pack horse, our Rocinante is lanky and clumsy. But he's also named Corazon, very appropriately, and I know where that comes from. There's the four, there's the spades, hearts, and clubs, and all that. That's part of the Don Quixote family and all that. But it's no accident, of course, that he's Corazon, right? That he is a character with a great heart, with a beautiful heart, in fact, and the symbolism that Oda endows the story with here is just so wonderful, and how this is a symbol that Trafalgar Law takes into himself, that it's on his jacket, that it is emphasized through his ability to manipulate his own heart. So there's a lot of neat stuff in here, symbolism with the heart. But I absolutely love this character. Now, this is the character where we see compassion being portrayed in its most beautiful way in this saga. And maybe you could argue in One Piece in general so far. I love this character so much. Corazon, from, you know, even the idea that he works with Sengoku from the Navy to undo the harm that his brother does. He does this out of compassion, of course, because he doesn't want to see that harm, that hurt, that suffering in the world. So he tries his best to alleviate it. He feels what other people would be going through. You know, even his fake hatred for kids, to keep them away from the influence of his brother and the Don Quixote family. That is an act of compassion. He forgives Trafalgar Law when Trafalgar skewers him because he feels the boy's pain. You know, he thinks that his own pain is nothing next to Trafalgar's pain. This is compassion, right? And his desire to save Trafalgar Law, not just from his disease, but also from the danger of Doflamingo corrupting him, the moral danger that he is in this situation. And so he goes on the quest for this cure at the risk of his own life, essentially, right? At the risk of exposing himself as an agent of the Navy. And it's not the easiest quest, of course, but they end up going for the op fruit, which we know how that goes. He actually succeeds in finding this fruit and giving it to Trafalgar Law so that he can save his own life. And this is where he shows Trafalgar the meaning of compassion. And it's not just talk. He actually shows him. And he does it through sacrifice. Sacrifice is a huge part of compassion. I haven't talked about that yet, but often when we act compassionately towards others, it involves an element of sacrifice. And we see that here, beautifully illustrated in Rocinante, or in Corazon's act. He even tries to leave this boy with the memory of his smile, just as his own father tried to do for him, even as his older brother Doflamingo killed their father. Their father was trying to smile and apologizing for being their father, but trying to shield Rocinante from the horror of what Doflamingo was doing. This is a similar echo, I think, when he is saying his goodbye to Trafalgar Law. He wants to leave him with a smile and tells him that he loves him. This is what this child needed. And by loving him, Corazon gives Trafalgar Law meaning and purpose, as well as freedom. And this is also vastly important here, guys. Freedom. It is through this act of compassion that he gives such a gift, the gift of freedom. He frees him not only from Doflamingo and his corruptive influence, not only freedom from the disease that was looming over him all this time, but also freedom from his own hatred. A path toward a life of compassion, something that is confirmed, I think, when Trafalgar Law meets Luffy, that Luffy encourages this compassionate side of Trafalgar Law in the best way. And this freedom that Corazon gives to Trafalgar Law to pursue his best self is, of course, an echo of Luffy and Luffy's influence in the world. In dying and in holding on to life just long enough to keep Law silent through his devil fruit power, Rocinante gives Law life. He gives him life. And as a result, he continues to implement Corazon's will in the world. So even though Corazon has perished, even though he is no longer with us, his will is still in the world. His compassion, his desire to make the world better, because of his influence on Law. And Law rejects Doflamingo and his path and embraces the affirmation of life that we have that we see illustrated so often in the Straw Hats and, of course, with Luffy. And it is through such heart that Trafalgar Law lives. I also we've been talking about Luffy here, and of course, we can't not talk about Luffy in all of this, and we have Luffy's protection of his friends. Now, you could say that Luffy is a bit different in the way that he shows his compassion, for sure. But let's never forget that Luffy honors the dreams of his friends. He honors their will and their freedom, as I've just been emphasizing. And he also helps them when needed in order to pursue their will, their dreams. He will step in when they need his help. And he may prefer to be referred to as a pirate, not just any old pirate, but the king of the pirates, rather than a hero. But at the very least, I think we can say he's a pirate with compassion, one who won't allow harm to come to those that he loves. And we see this in the collision of the Supreme King Haki when he prevents Doflamingo from harming his friend, his family in Trafalgar Law. It's a beautiful moment. I love that panel. He serves as an inspiration for others as well here. Even people like glory-seeking Cavendish, or Cabbage, as he ends up being called, which is another great little shtick there. Cavendish shows loyalty and compassion for Trafalgar Law as they witness Luffy fighting Doflamingo. He shows understanding. This is Luffy's influence in the world. What determines Luffy the most is that Doflamingo and his cage, his bird cage, they not only bring harm to other people, but they take away the freedom of others. And this is what drives Luffy. He cannot stand the idea that Doflamingo is taking away the freedom of his friends, of other people. He brings himself to his limits, right? He brings himself to his absolute limits, not for his own glory, but for the sake of his friends. And so they don't have to experience the pain of having their dreams, their freedom ripped away from them. This is compassion. Luffy also very keenly recognizes and denies the desire of people like Doflamingo to control others. Right? He sees that for what it is. He sees that because abusers are people who control other people. That's what they do. They get their jollies from controlling other people and hurting other people and enjoying that sense of control as they hurt others. They try to isolate others and they hurt them, and that gives them some semblance of control, right? Luffy recognizes that sickness and he denies it, right? This is his love for freedom. It's not just for himself. He extends that love of freedom to others. And it is that love of freedom that helps him to prevail because he wants it for everyone. And that's what makes him a wonderful king of the pirates. His being crowned by the injured Gats, the announcer guy there, the winner, it's a moment of triumph for everyone. Everyone shares in that moment of triumph on Dressrosa. What a beautiful end to this saga, actually. There's a destruction of much evil in the world, but there's also the promise of much more to come. And we have the world government shaken here at the end of this. Bigger players like Kaido, King of the Beasts. Okay, I am intimidated. I think I'm appropriately frightened of this guy who cannot seemingly be killed. He is looming on the horizon. He's going to show up. But yeah, it's a beautiful ending to this. Just loved the role that Luffy plays here in the liberation of Dressrosa through his compassion for those people, for his friends, and their right to their freedom. And before the end, there is time for one last act of compassion on Luffy's part. This was also a bit of a tearjerker for me, I will admit, but he risks capture by the Navy, which I love how Fujitora delays the pursuit of the Straw Hats through his little dice game there. But Luffy risks his capture by reuniting Rebecca and her father. He returns in order to show Rebecca what Kyros has done, essentially, and allows her to make the decision as well. This is the great thing about Luffy. He never takes away someone's freedom in his attempt to help them do the right thing. So this is wonderful. I love how Rebecca makes that decision and abdicates, essentially, gives the position of heir to the throne to her aunt, who is very worthy of it, I think. Viola is wonderful. But he gives her that little push and helps her to see what Kyros is actually doing. And that's just such a beautiful moment that she decides for love over power. And that's One Piece for you, right? And the people of Dressrosa also commit one final act of compassion. And this is something that you see them... again, I like to go back to this idea that it is actually empowering to fight oppression and evil and wrong through peaceful means, that it can be empowering. And the people of Dressrosa have learned through working together against the birdcage, against Doflamingo, that they can make a difference. And so at the end, with all that debris looming over Luffy and his friends, people of Dressrosa rush in to make a difference. And they allow Luffy and the others to make their escape. And of course, there are some really cool moments there between Fujitora and Luffy at the end as well. But you have this affiliation of the Straw Hats. It's really, because of Luffy, more of a friendship than an official or formal alliance, I guess. Because to him, being king of the pirates is not, again, about power. It's about freedom. And he wishes to extend that freedom, the ability to follow your dreams, to follow your will to everyone. And that is an act of compassion in my mind.